The worst prisons are the ones that convince you the person beside you is your greatest enemy. Ethan Brooks had always believed surviving a blizzard would come down to luck, preparation, and a little stubbornness. But nothing had prepared him for the moment he pushed open the weather-beaten door of an abandoned ranger station high in the Rocky Mountains and realized fate had a much crueler sense of humor. Snow whipped across the landscape in blinding waves, burying the narrow road he had driven less than an hour earlier beneath drifts that were already several feet deep. His phone had lost service miles back, his SUV had become hopelessly trapped, and the only thing standing between him and the freezing wind was the aging cabin that looked as though it had not welcomed visitors in years. He stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat, grateful for walls that still held against the storm, only to hear another door slam open behind him seconds later. Ethan turned, his breath catching as a tall man in a black winter coat entered carrying a silver metal case in one hand. Even beneath the layers of snow clinging to his shoulders, there was no mistaking the sharp blue eyes or the calm confidence that seemed untouched by the chaos outside. Damian Blackwood. The Alpha Mafia boss Ethan had spent years avoiding whenever their paths crossed through charity events, business circles, or whispered rumors that always painted Damian as someone impossible to trust. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The wind howled through the doorway until an automated emergency system suddenly activated with a loud metallic click. Heavy steel shutters slid into place over the windows, reinforced locks engaged with mechanical precision, and a warning light above the entrance flashed red before a pre-recorded voice calmly announced that severe weather protocol had sealed the shelter until outside conditions became safe. Ethan rushed toward the door, grabbing the handle with both hands, but it refused to move. He pressed the emergency release several times with growing frustration while snow pounded relentlessly against the building from outside. Damian remained surprisingly composed, quietly setting the metal case onto an old wooden table before examining the control panel near the entrance. "It won't open," Ethan said, unable to hide the irritation in his voice. "Not until the storm passes." Damian glanced toward the reinforced windows where nothing remained visible except endless white. "That's what the system says." Ethan folded his arms, studying the man he least wanted to spend the next few hours with. Except the weather report he had heard earlier suggested the storm could last close to 48 hours. 2 full days. Inside a locked station, alone with Damian Blackwood. His eyes drifted toward the mysterious silver case resting on the table. Damian noticed immediately and calmly placed one gloved hand over the handle without saying a word. That simple movement fueled every suspicion Ethan already carried. Why would someone travel through an incoming blizzard with a locked metal case? Why choose this isolated route? Why remain so calm while trapped? Ethan's imagination filled the silence with possibilities, none of them comforting. The heating system hummed weakly overhead. Old wooden beams creaked under the growing weight of fresh snow, and somewhere deeper inside the station, a loose vent rattled in the wind. Damian removed his gloves, scanned the dusty room, and quietly began checking shelves for emergency supplies as though surviving together had already become an accepted fact. Ethan watched carefully, refusing to lower his guard. Outside, the storm erased every road leading back to civilization. Inside, another storm had only just begun. The silence inside the ranger station felt almost louder than the blizzard outside. Ethan paced across the worn wooden floor, stopping every few moments to glance through the narrow reinforced window where nothing remained except swirling white snow. The emergency lights cast a soft amber glow over the room, making the old shelter feel both safer and strangely smaller. Damian Blackwood had already inspected every cabinet with quiet efficiency, gathering blankets, canned food, bottled water, flashlights, and a dusty first aid kit before arranging everything neatly on a table near the fireplace. Ethan watched from a distance, uncertain whether the organized routine reflected genuine experience or simply another layer of the mystery surrounding the Alpha Mafia boss. Neither of them seemed interested in breaking the silence first. Finally, Ethan walked toward the emergency radio mounted on the wall and pressed the transmit button several times. Static answered every attempt. He adjusted the frequency again, hoping another ranger station might respond, but only the crackling sound of interference filled the room. Damien calmly approached without speaking, studying the faded instruction label beside the controls before pointing toward a handwritten maintenance note taped to the side. The antenna had been damaged during the previous winter and would only function when weather conditions improved. Ethan sighed and leaned against the wall. 48 hours suddenly felt much longer than 2 days. They naturally divided the station into separate spaces without discussing it. Ethan chose the corner closest to the fireplace, while Damien settled near the supply shelves on the opposite side. The distance between them measured only a few yards, yet it felt much greater because of years of assumptions neither man seemed ready to question. Every so often Ethan caught himself looking toward the silver metal case resting beside Damien's chair. It remained locked, untouched, and impossible to ignore. Damien noticed the repeated glances but offered no explanation, simply placing his winter gloves neatly beside it before checking the remaining batteries stored inside a cabinet. As afternoon slowly faded beneath the endless storm clouds, the temperature inside the shelter began dropping despite the aging heater. The machine produced an uneven humming noise followed by an uncomfortable silence before struggling back to life. Ethan frowned toward the ceiling. The heating system sounded exhausted. Damien quietly walked to the utility panel and examined a collection of old gauges before returning with an expression that remained calm but thoughtful. He explained that the generator appeared unstable and that if it failed completely, repairing it quickly would become important. For everyone's comfort, Ethan crossed his arms. "Everyone?" he asked with a cautious smile. "There are only 2 of us." Damien looked toward the blizzard outside the window. "That is enough reason to keep it running." The answer surprised Ethan more than he expected. He had anticipated arrogance or cold indifference, not simple practicality. Even so, suspicion remained stronger than curiosity. As evening settled over the mountains, they shared a modest dinner of canned vegetable soup warmed on a portable camping stove they found inside a storage cabinet. They sat at opposite ends of the same table, speaking only when necessary. Outside, the wind continued its relentless song, shaking the walls but never breaking them. Inside, another barrier still stood firmly in place, invisible yet far more difficult to overcome than steel doors or heavy snow. Neither Ethan nor Damien realized that before the storm ended, the greatest challenge would not be surviving the weather, but deciding whether old judgments deserved to survive with it. Morning arrived without sunlight. The storm had buried every window beneath layers of packed snow, leaving only a dim gray glow filtering through the reinforced glass. Ethan woke to an unfamiliar silence before realizing the steady hum of the heater had disappeared. Within seconds, the air inside the ranger station felt noticeably colder. He pulled his jacket tighter and looked across the room, finding Damien already standing beside the utility panel with a flashlight in one hand. The Alpha Mafia boss listened carefully to the generator room below the floor before turning back with quiet concern. The generator had stopped completely. Without exchanging unnecessary words, both men understood that waiting for rescue was no longer enough. If they wanted the shelter to remain livable until the blizzard ended, they would have to repair the aging machine together. They opened a narrow maintenance hatch leading into a cramped utility space beneath the station. Dust-covered forgotten shelves filled with old tools, spare filters, and handwritten maintenance logs dating back many winters. Ethan held the flashlight while Damien carefully examined the generator, tracing a loose fuel line and clearing away ice that had formed around an exterior ventilation pipe. Neither man attempted to control the entire task alone. Ethan searched through the storage shelves until he located replacement clamps mentioned in the maintenance notes, while Damien adjusted worn connections with steady hands. The work demanded patience rather than strength, and slowly the tension between them shifted from suspicion to quiet cooperation. After nearly an hour, the generator finally responded with a low mechanical rumble before returning to a steady rhythm. Moments later, warm air flowed gently through the vents once again. Ethan released a relieved breath that surprised even himself. "I was beginning to think we would spend the rest of this storm wrapped in every blanket we could find," he admitted. Damien allowed the smallest hint of a smile. "I prefer warm rooms." It was the first light-hearted sentence Ethan had ever heard from him. Back upstairs, they brushed snow away from one of the emergency ventilation openings to improve airflow. The task required both of them to push against the heavy drift that had nearly sealed the outside vent completely. Fresh snow immediately rushed across the opening with every gust, forcing them to work quickly before securing the protective cover once more. By the time they returned inside, both were exhausted and covered in melting snow. Ethan prepared hot water on the camping stove while Damien organized the remaining food supplies. As Ethan counted the cans, he realized something unexpected. Damien had quietly placed one of his own meal portions back into the cabinet instead of opening it. When Ethan looked over, Damien simply reached for a mug of hot water instead. "You skipped lunch," Ethan observed. Damien shrugged with calm indifference. "There is enough." Ethan knew there was enough only because Damien had chosen less for himself. The realization lingered longer than he wanted to admit. Throughout the afternoon, they checked every room together, making certain no pipes had frozen and that the roof showed no signs of leaking beneath the growing weight of snow. Conversation remained brief, but gradually became easier. They discussed hiking trails, mountain weather, and favorite national parks instead of old rumors or painful assumptions. Ethan found himself noticing details that never matched the stories he had heard over the years. Damien listened carefully before answering, never interrupted, and treated every practical problem with quiet respect instead of authority. Outside, the blizzard continued without mercy, erasing every familiar landmark beneath endless white. Inside the isolated station, however, something far less predictable had begun. The distance between two lifelong enemies had not disappeared, but with every shared task, every honest conversation, and every unexpected act of consideration, it had become just a little smaller than it had been the night before. The storm showed no sign of weakening by late afternoon. Thick snow continued piling against the walls of the ranger station, and every powerful gust made the old structure groan as though the mountain itself were testing its strength. Ethan had just finished stacking extra firewood near the fireplace when a faint sound interrupted the steady rhythm of the wind. It was not the creaking of timber or the whistle of air slipping through old cracks. It was a distant mechanical vibration, followed by the muffled crunch of footsteps outside. He immediately looked toward Damien, who had already heard it. Without panic, Damien quietly dimmed the lantern closest to the window and walked toward the reinforced entrance. Both men listened carefully as another sound echoed through the storm, this time closer than before. Someone was outside. Ethan instinctively stepped back, his heartbeat quickening. No rescue teams were expected until the roads reopened, and no ordinary traveler would willingly climb this mountain during a blizzard. Damien glanced toward the silver metal case resting beside the table before calmly moving it farther from the entrance. His expression remained steady, but Ethan noticed a seriousness that had not appeared before. A shadow briefly crossed one of the narrow windows, disappearing almost as quickly as it came. Moments later, another shape became visible through the swirling snow. Whoever stood outside seemed to be searching the building rather than asking for help. The reinforced door remained securely locked by the emergency system, preventing anyone from entering without the proper override. Even so, Ethan felt an uneasy chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Do you know who that is?" he asked quietly. Damien hesitated for only a moment before answering. "I cannot be certain." The careful wording only deepened Ethan's curiosity. Together, they moved several heavy wooden tables and storage cabinets away from the center of the room, creating a clear path while also shielding the windows from direct view. They worked without arguing, each understanding what the other intended before speaking. Ethan collected flashlights, extra blankets, and emergency supplies into one corner of the station in case they needed to remain away from the entrance for several hours. Damien inspected every window latch and confirmed that the reinforced shutters remained fully engaged. Outside, another figure briefly appeared before vanishing behind blowing snow. No voices reached the station. Only the relentless wind surrounded the isolated shelter. As darkness settled over the mountains once again, the emergency radio suddenly produced a burst of static strong enough to make both men turn toward it. Damien adjusted the volume, while Ethan carefully rotated the tuning dial. A weak transmission finally emerged through the interference. The message was incomplete, broken apart by heavy atmospheric noise, but a few words remained understandable. Mountain rescue teams had suspended all travel because visibility had fallen below safe limits, and every road leading toward the station remained completely blocked. Assistance would not arrive until conditions improved. The signal disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived. Ethan slowly lowered the microphone, accepting that they were entirely on their own for another night. He looked toward Damien, expecting to see frustration, yet instead found quiet determination. For the first time since becoming trapped together, Ethan realized that he no longer viewed Damien as the greatest danger inside the station. Whatever waited beyond the snow-covered walls had shifted his perspective, and although questions about the mysterious silver case remained unanswered, one thing had become surprisingly clear. If they hoped to reach the end of the storm safely, they would have to trust each other long before either of them felt completely ready. The second night settled over the mountains with an uneasy stillness that somehow felt more unsettling than the howling wind. Ethan sat beside the fireplace, watching the flames dance across the old stone hearth while Damien quietly studied a faded topographic map spread across the wooden table. Every few minutes they heard distant sounds outside, never loud enough to identify, yet consistent enough to remind them they were not entirely alone on the mountain. The emergency shutters continued protecting the ranger station, but the uncertainty beyond them lingered inside every quiet moment. Ethan finally broke the silence. "You knew those people were not rescue workers." Damien looked up slowly before folding the map. For the first time since they had become trapped together, he seemed to reach a decision. Without speaking immediately, he unlocked the silver metal case that had remained closed since the beginning of the storm. Ethan instinctively leaned forward, expecting stacks of cash, expensive jewelry, or confidential business contracts. Instead, he found organized folders filled with documents, photographs, financial records, and several encrypted storage drives carefully sealed inside protective cases. Damien gently lifted one folder and placed it on the table between them. The pages contained transaction records connecting a network of shell companies to illegal financial operations spread across several states. Another folder included photographs of warehouses, shipping records, and handwritten notes from investigators. Ethan looked up in confusion. "This is not what I expected." Damien nodded quietly. "Most people expect something very different." He explained that for years he had quietly gathered evidence against influential members of the criminal organization that had once controlled many of his business interests. Walking away had never been simple because too many innocent employees and families depended on those companies for their livelihoods. Instead of destroying everything at once, Damien had spent years documenting corruption, preparing information that could allow honest authorities to dismantle the network without harming people who had done nothing wrong. The mountain meeting had been arranged with a federal investigator before the blizzard unexpectedly closed every road. Ethan slowly turned another page, realizing the careful notes represented years of patient work rather than personal ambition. Suddenly, many things began making sense. Damien's constant attention to the metal case, his calm attitude under pressure, even the unfamiliar figures outside the station all fit together in a way Ethan had never imagined. "You were never protecting yourself," Ethan said quietly. "You were protecting this." Damien answered with a small nod. "If those records disappear, many people who have waited years for justice may never receive it." Ethan leaned back, absorbing everything he had learned. The stories repeated in newspapers, whispered during charity events, and passed through business circles had painted Damien as a ruthless alpha mafia boss interested only in power. Sitting across the table now, Ethan saw someone carrying an enormous responsibility instead. Before either man could continue, another loud gust shook the station. Snow slid heavily from the roof, followed by a deep rumble somewhere farther up the mountainside. Both men hurried outside only as far as the reinforced entrance could safely allow, peering through the narrow observation panel. A small avalanche had crossed the trail below, burying what little remained of the access road beneath another massive layer of snow. Their isolation had become complete. Returning inside, Ethan carefully closed the observation cover and looked toward Damien with entirely different eyes. Suspicion had not vanished overnight, and many unanswered questions still remained, but respect had quietly replaced fear. As the fire warmed the room and the storm continued its endless journey across the mountains, Ethan understood that The greatest surprise had never been the blizzard or the locked shelter. It had been discovering that the man he had considered his worst enemy might actually be risking everything to protect people he would probably never meet. The storm entered its third morning with a strange sense of calm, but the mountain remained buried beneath countless inches of fresh snow. Ethan woke to the sound of soft, dripping water instead of fierce wind. At first, he welcomed the quiet, believing the worst had finally passed, until he noticed small drops falling from one corner of the ceiling near the storage shelves. Damien was already there, studying the wooden beams above with careful attention. The weight of the accumulated snow had begun pressing against one section of the roof, allowing melted ice to seep through narrow cracks. It was not an emergency yet, but ignoring it could quickly turn a manageable problem into something much more serious. Without hesitation, both men gathered ladders, rope, buckets, and every sturdy board they could find inside the station. Working together had become almost natural now. Ethan climbed carefully onto the lower platform inside the attic access, while Damien secured the ladder below and handed him replacement boards one at a time. They reinforced the weakened section from underneath before carefully clearing packed snow away from the roof vent using long maintenance poles designed for winter conditions. The work demanded patience, steady communication, and complete trust. More than once Ethan found himself depending on Damien's calm instructions before taking another careful step. Hours earlier, he would have questioned every suggestion. Now he simply listened. By midday, the dripping had stopped completely, and both men sat near the fireplace catching their breath with steaming mugs of hot chocolate prepared from emergency supplies they had discovered in a forgotten cabinet. Ethan smiled for the first time without hesitation. I never imagined this shelter would become the place where I finally learned you were nothing like the stories. Damien looked quietly into the fire before answering. Stories are easier to believe than conversations. The simple sentence lingered in the warm room long after he finished speaking. Ethan thought about every rumor he had accepted without asking a single question. He remembered avoiding Damien during public events, assuming every silent expression hid arrogance instead of caution. Now those memories felt strangely distant. A faint electronic tone suddenly interrupted the peaceful silence. Both men looked toward the emergency radio. This time the signal arrived far more clearly. Mountain rescue officials announced that weather conditions had improved enough for reconnaissance flights to begin later that afternoon, although ground crews still required additional time to reopen the roads. The transmission ended with instructions for stranded travelers to remain inside secure shelters until contacted directly. Relief filled the station, yet it also carried an unexpected feeling neither man anticipated. Their isolation was finally nearing its end. Ethan walked toward one of the narrow windows and gently brushed away frost gathering along the edges. For the first time since arriving, he caught a glimpse of blue sky breaking through the retreating clouds. Sunlight reflected brilliantly across endless fields of untouched snow, transforming the harsh mountain landscape into something peaceful. Damien quietly joined him beside the window, neither man speaking for several moments. There was no awkwardness left between them, only comfortable silence shaped by shared challenges and quiet understanding. Ethan realized that surviving together had changed far more than his opinion of Damien. It had changed the way he judged people altogether. Outside, the storm was finally surrendering to the morning light. Inside the old ranger station, two men who had entered as determined enemies now stood side by side, ready to face whatever waited beyond the mountain with honesty, respect, and a trust that neither of them could have imagined only a few days before. The afternoon sun slowly reclaimed the frozen mountain, casting long golden beams across the endless blanket of snow surrounding the ranger station. For the first time in days, the silence outside felt peaceful, instead of threatening. Ethan stood near the observation window, watching distant clouds drift away from the mountain peaks, while the emergency radio quietly monitored incoming rescue frequencies. Every few minutes, a clear transmission confirmed that helicopters had begun surveying isolated routes, but deep snow still prevented ground crews from reaching several remote shelters. Relief mixed with patience as both men accepted they still had a little more time before leaving the station behind. Damien carefully organized the documents inside the silver metal case once again, checking each folder with the same quiet precision Ethan had come to recognize. After closing the final file, He paused for a long moment before carrying the case to the table where Ethan sat reviewing an old trail map. Without hesitation, Damien slid one folder across the wooden surface. Ethan looked up with surprise. "I trust you should know the entire story," Damien said calmly. Inside the folder were personal letters, newspaper clippings, and photographs dating back many years. Unlike the financial evidence Ethan had already seen, these papers revealed something far more personal. Damien explained that his family business had once been honest until powerful individuals gradually transformed parts of the organization into criminal operations without the knowledge of many employees. Walking away had never been as simple as resigning from a position because countless innocent workers depended on those companies to support their families. Instead of abandoning them, Damien had remained inside long enough to quietly gather evidence while protecting legitimate employees from becoming victims themselves. Every decision had required patience, sacrifice, and absolute secrecy. Ethan listened without interrupting. The carefully collected records showed years spent helping investigators, supporting witnesses anonymously, and documenting financial misconduct that stretched far beyond a single company. Suddenly, the quiet restraint Damien carried every day seemed less mysterious and more understandable. Before Ethan could respond, the emergency radio crackled again with unexpected urgency. A rescue coordinator announced that a temporary communications beacon had detected movement several hundred yards below the station near the snow-covered access road. Search aircraft would investigate the signal within the next hour, but everyone inside the shelter should avoid unnecessary travel because unstable snow conditions remained throughout the mountain. Damien looked toward the window, then quietly closed the silver case. If those people searching for these records are still nearby, they may notice the helicopter before the rescue crew notices us, he said thoughtfully. Ethan immediately understood the concern. The arrival of help could also reveal the station's location to anyone still watching the mountain. After a brief silence, Damien reached a decision. He carefully removed one encrypted storage drive from the case and placed it into Ethan's hand. If something unexpected happens before the investigators arrive, this must reach them. Ethan stared at the small device, realizing how much trust Damien had placed in him. Only a few days earlier, they could barely share a room without suspicion. Now Damien was placing years of careful work into Ethan's care without hesitation. Ethan closed his fingers around the drive and met Damien's steady blue eyes. "You are not carrying this responsibility alone anymore," he said quietly. A faint smile appeared across Damien's face, genuine and unguarded for perhaps the first time since the blizzard had brought them together. Outside, the brilliant afternoon sky continued clearing above the mountains, but both men understood that the greatest test still lay ahead. Rescue was finally within reach, yet the choices they made before leaving the station would determine far more than how their journey through the snow would end. Late in the afternoon, the steady thumping of helicopter blades echoed faintly across the mountains, carried by the crisp winter air instead of the fierce winds that had trapped Ethan and Damien for days. Both men hurried to the observation window and caught their first glimpse of a rescue aircraft circling several distant ridges, carefully searching for isolated shelters still hidden beneath the snow. Hope filled the ranger station, but Damien remained thoughtful instead of celebrating. He quietly explained that the helicopter crew would need time to identify the safest landing area because deep snowdrifts and unstable terrain still covered much of the mountain. They could not assume help would arrive immediately. Ethan nodded in agreement and suggested they prepare everything before the rescue team reached them. Together they packed blankets, emergency supplies, and the remaining food into organized piles so nothing useful would be left behind. Damien carefully secured the silver metal case while Ethan placed the encrypted storage drive safely inside an inner pocket of his winter jacket, remembering the promise he had made only hours earlier. As they finished organizing the station, the emergency radio crackled once again. This time the rescue coordinator announced that crews had identified the ranger station but could not land until engineers confirmed the nearby snowpack was stable. The helicopter would continue monitoring the area from a safe distance while additional support traveled toward the mountain. The news was encouraging, yet it also meant they would remain inside a little longer. Ethan walked outside only as far as the reinforced entrance allowed, looking across the brilliant white landscape now sparkling beneath clear blue skies. Fresh animal tracks crossed the untouched snow, while the avalanche that had buried the access road remained frozen below like a reminder of everything they had survived together. Damien joined him, quietly studying the mountains before speaking. When we leave here, everything becomes public. Ethan understood exactly what he meant. The documents, the investigation, and the years of quiet work Damien had carried alone would finally move into the hands of the authorities. There would be interviews, questions, and countless headlines. Ethan smiled gently. Then you will not face any of it alone. Damien looked at him with genuine gratitude, his usually reserved expression softening in a way Ethan had never imagined during their first uneasy hours inside the station. Suddenly, the rescue helicopter flew closer, passing directly above the trees before slowing into a wide circle over the clearing. Bright sunlight reflected from its windows as it transmitted instructions through the emergency radio. The crew requested that everyone remain inside until they completed a final safety assessment of the landing zone. Ethan acknowledged the message, then stepped back from the radio with a quiet sense of relief. There was no longer any reason to doubt that help was coming. The long days of uncertainty had finally reached their final chapter. As evening sunlight painted the snowy peaks with shades of gold and amber, Ethan and Damien sat beside the fireplace one last time. They shared hot coffee prepared from the station's remaining supplies, speaking easily about ordinary things they hoped to do after returning home. What began as forced survival had quietly become something far more meaningful. Neither man mentioned old rumors, old misunderstandings, or old resentment anymore. Those burdens had slowly disappeared with the retreating storm. Outside, the helicopter continued circling patiently above the mountain, waiting for the signal that the landing area was secure. Inside the ranger station, two former enemies waited together with complete confidence, knowing that whatever challenges awaited beyond the snow, they would walk toward them side by side instead of standing on opposite sides ever again. The following morning arrived beneath a cloudless sky, so brilliantly blue that it almost seemed impossible the same mountains had been buried beneath a relentless blizzard only days before. Sunlight shimmered across the endless snowfields as the steady sound of helicopter blades finally grew louder, this time stopping directly above the clearing outside the ranger station. The emergency radio confirmed what Ethan and Damien had been waiting to hear. The landing zone had been inspected, conditions were stable enough, and the rescue crew was ready to bring them home. The heavy security system disengaged with a series of metallic clicks before the reinforced door slowly opened for the first time since they had become trapped inside. A rush of fresh mountain air filled the station, carrying with it the crisp scent of pine trees and melting snow. Ethan paused at the doorway, looking back one final time at the quiet shelter that had transformed two determined enemies into trusted companions. Damien lifted the silver metal case while Ethan adjusted the strap of his backpack, making certain the encrypted storage drive remained secure inside his jacket. Together they stepped into the bright morning light. The rescue crew greeted them with warm smiles, offering blankets and hot drinks before carefully guiding them toward the waiting helicopter. During the short flight down the mountain, Ethan looked through the window at the winding roads slowly emerging beneath the retreating snow. It felt as though the landscape itself had changed along with everything he believed about the man sitting across from him. After landing at the Rescue Coordination Center, federal investigators quietly met Damien exactly as planned. Without hesitation, Damien handed over the silver metal case along with every document and storage device he had spent years protecting. Ethan stood beside him throughout the entire exchange, honoring the promise he had made inside the ranger station. Over the following weeks, the evidence allowed investigators to move forward with long-awaited legal proceedings against the individuals responsible for years of financial corruption. Honest employees were protected, families kept their livelihoods, and businesses with legitimate operations received the opportunity to rebuild under new leadership. Damien never sought public attention for what he had done. Instead, he returned to the quiet work of helping those whose futures depended upon stability rather than headlines. Ethan admired that choice more than any speech or public recognition could have inspired. Several months later, after winter had given way to the first warm days of spring, Ethan visited a community mountain conservation event organized to celebrate the reopening of the trails once closed by the blizzard. Volunteers planted young pine trees, families explored nature exhibits, and children laughed while learning about wildlife preservation. As Ethan finished helping a group of students assemble birdhouses, he noticed a familiar figure walking toward him carrying 2 cups of coffee. Damien smiled with the same quiet warmth Ethan had come to know inside the ranger station. There were no locked doors between them now, no storms hiding the horizon, and no misunderstandings left to separate their paths. They spent the afternoon walking along the newly reopened trail, talking about future adventures instead of past assumptions. Before leaving, Damien looked toward the mountains glowing beneath the setting sun and softly admitted that the blizzard had taken away certainty but given him something far more valuable. Ethan smiled and answered that sometimes the hardest journeys led people exactly where they were meant to be. Together they continued down the trail, side by side beneath the clear American sky, grateful that one unexpected winter storm had not only changed the course of their lives, but had also revealed that trust, kindness, and understanding could grow even in the coldest places when 2 hearts chose to leave old fears behind.